July 26, 1845. 2 whaling ships entered Baffin Bay. It was well into hunting season, but the experienced Captain Martin knew the importance to cover as much distance as possible in the summer months. In only a few months, the landscape would become dangerous and unforgiving. However, he made a brief stop when he sighted 2 ships waiting in the bay. The Erebus and Terror were keenly awaiting the moment they could pass through the pack ice and proceed to travel to the Barrow Strait via the Lancaster Sound. The boats pulled alongside each other. Martin was keen to speak to Franklin and an old friend of his from the whaling fleet, James Reed, the ice master of the Erebus. Franklin spoke warmly of the high spirits of the crew, and detailed with joy how advanced and prepared the ships were, and further expressed his certainty that the voyage would be over within a year, a sentiment that Martin highly doubted but said nothing of. Franklin would go on to invite the captain on board the Erebus to join him and the officers for dinner. Martin, however, declined this offer, not wanting to fall behind. Even one night's delay could be catastrophic in these conditions. As Martin left, both crews waved to one another and cheered to each other's luck and health. This chance encounter would be the last time the Franklin expedition were ever sighted by European men.
Was homeward bound one night on the deep. Swinging in my hammock, I fell asleep. I dreamed a dream and I thought it true, concerning Franklin and his gallant crew. With 100 seamen he sailed away to the frozen ocean in the month of May, to seek a passage around the pole, where we poor seamen do sometimes go.
Although we know the ultimate fate of these men, we cannot let hindsight blind us to just how optimistic and enthusiastic the crew were. Captain Martin's testimonies of their high spirits are certainly backed up by the letters sent from Greenland before they embarked on the final step of their journey. For many of the younger officers, it was a chance to make their name in naval history. In their minds, they had nothing to lose, but everything to gain. During the first 3 months of the voyage, Commander Fitzjames kept a journal, which he would later send to his sister-in-law, Elizabeth Conyngham. He cheerfully describes the camaraderie between the men on one particular evening, in which he states, "Good sir is catching extraordinary creatures in the net, while Gore and Divorce are over the side poking it with a stick while they smoke cigars, all the while Osmer is laughing." Despite the positive atmosphere among the crew, there were still elements of anxieties and skepticism creeping in. This mostly came from the seasoned Arctic explorers among them. But such feelings could be innate in these men. Voyaging in such harsh conditions required one to be cautious, as well as endlessly adaptable, and to make decisions based on the conditions that came. Although this seemed to be a problem for Franklin, who was very much set in his ways and took poorly to criticism or questioning. Prior to their landing in Greenland, Franklin had made a misdirection near Disco Bay, which led them off course and delayed their progress. Although Crozier noticed this, he said nothing. This could have been to humiliate him in front of the crew and make him learn his lesson the hard way, or, perhaps more likely, he was steadfastly loyal to his position as second in command, and knew it wouldn't have been his place to question his superior. In addition to knowing that Franklin was hard to persuade, and knowing that he didn't react too well to confrontation. In a letter to James Clark Ross, Crozier confirms his concerns. He writes, "I fear we will blunder into the ice. James, I wish you were here. then I would have no doubt into that we were pursuing the proper path. Other crew members shared similar feelings to Crozier, and spoke out to family members not to trust the official news. For example, Thomas Blankley, an ice master on the Terror, wrote to his wife that she should not be surprised if they were gone for up to 7 years. As an ex-whaler and an Arctic veteran, his estimate was 3 to 5 years minimum. Even John Irving, a young lieutenant who had never been in such a climate, had still done a lot of research on other expeditions, was not fooled by the idea of it being a year or two. In a letter to his sister, his own estimate was up to 3 years. Although all of this was just speculation, their fears were confirmed as they left Baffin Bay into the Lancaster Sound later than ideal. And what was worse was that winter set in quicker than usual. By the time they reached Beechy Island, they were forced to make a winter camp due to the pack ice blocking their path. Even if they had been quicker entering the Lancaster Sound, this is not something that could have been avoided, as the Canadian Arctic would suffer some of the worst winters and bleak summers from 1845 to 1848. What remains of the winter camp at Beechy Island has raised a great many questions as well as providing invaluable answers as to the fate of the crew. In 1850, William Parry first discovered the camp, only to find a sight that baffled himself and his crew. The Beechy Island camp was unlike any other Royal Naval camp, as in it violated most of the protocols. Franklin and his crew had not erected any wooden structures that would typically be built for storage or shelter. And more importantly, they had left behind no messages. This was highly unusual. It was Royal Naval protocol to leave behind written messages whenever a camp was made. This was in order to inform any rescuers or those following the mission as to their safety and their intentions ongoing. These written messages were deposited in cairns, which were small structures made out of stone and iron, and were either built by the crew themselves or previous crews that had travelled in the same space. The locations of prior built cairns were well known and publicised. There were in fact 2 prior built cairns only 2 miles of Beechy Island, that anyone in command or with just access to a map would be well aware of. Naturally, the lack of a written message caused great concern for Perry and his crew. Another curiosity observed by Perry were a large number of empty food cans. These cans were not simply strewn across the beach. They were meticulously arranged in a large cross. Yet the most harrowing discovery on Beechy Island were the 3 graves of men who died that winter. In order to prove the validity of his claims, Parry brought one of the grave plaques back to England. These 3 men were John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Bryan. And although the science of the 19th century could not tell us much about how they died, the advancement of modern forensics could. So in 1984, the world waited as the remains of these 3 men were exhumed and tested. Owen Beatty was the archaeologist who led the exhumation of the 3 bodies on Beechy Island. Due to the permafrost, the bodies were perfectly preserved. But the tissue samples of these bodies are not the only important factor, as their manner of burial can tell us a great deal about the crew that buried them. The first of the 3 men to die was John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker who had been born in Manchester. He died on the 1st of January 1846. Once thawed from the ice, Beatty's team noted how well preserved he was, stating he looked seldom different to the way he may have when he died. A great deal of care was paid to the burial of John Torrington. His jaw was bound and his face shrouded, and the casket was packed with wood shavings. This relatively comforting burial was a direct contrast to the look of John Torrington. At the time of his death, it's estimated that he weighed only 85 pounds. Analysis of the tissue samples showed that Torrington may have been sick for months, a combination of pneumonia and TB. This diagnosis is further backed up by the scarring on his lungs. Although the next man died only 3 days later on the 4th of January, his burial was very different to John Torrington's. This was John Hartnell. whom the researchers discovered had been autopsied prior to his burial. Autopsies were rarely carried out on board ships. In such closed quarters, it often upset those on board ships. Additionally, Victorian society viewed autopsies poorly, viewing them as disrespectful to the dead. This concern was particularly prominent with the high number of body snatchings in the last few decades. Therefore, this shows a large amount of concern on the doctor's part. This suggests that there may have been a fear that there was a viral infection on board the ship. Though it's impossible to know what conclusion these doctors came to, modern analysis of a fingernail sample taken from Hartnell shows that he likely died of zinc deficiency. If the burial of John Hartnell doesn't show enough concern, the burial of William Brine in April certainly shows a sharp increase. Unlike Torrington and Hartnell, Brine's body shows signs of early decomposition and was partially gnawed by rats. This suggests there was at least a few days' delay before his burial. Furthermore, it seems that when he was finally buried, it was done in haste. His jaw had not been bound, a red handkerchief was placed over his face rather than a grave shroud. One arm had fallen off and been placed under the body. And finally, the coffin was too small, causing his face to become disfigured. So why was his burial delayed? It can't be explained with the inability to penetrate the ice, as Brine died in April, which would have made digging a grave far easier than the previous January burials. I can imagine that the death may have been kept secret, at least for a short time, in order to avoid upsetting the crew further. Forensic data suggests that he died of TB. If this was the case, it would be easy to deny visitors and to keep him in quarantine so as to protect himself and the rest of the crew. It is also assumed that they left Beechey Island shortly after the burial of Brine. If Brine's death had been revealed earlier, it may have jeopardised their progress, as the panic may cause the crew to delay themselves. It can also be considered that the surgeons may have been doing tests on the body, again to rule out the possibility of an infection that could spread to the rest of the crew. However, the lack of an autopsy makes this less likely. Despite the different causes of death and the differences in the burial of these men, one common factor unites them, and it may explain the fate of the rest of the crew when they sailed on. By studying hair samples from William Brine and the nail sample from John Hartnell, it was found that these men had significantly higher amounts of lead in their system. Whilst we would expect to find a higher amount of lead in the system of someone living in the Victorian era, Torrington, Brine and Hartnell were found to have levels above the average for the time. Lead poisoning may not have been the cause of their death. It would have weakened their immune system, therefore making them succumb to their diseases far quicker than expected. We can therefore assume that other members of the crew were also suffering from a similar illness, making their immune systems weak. This leads us to the question of just where was this lead poisoning coming from? In part 1 of this series, I briefly mentioned a water filtration system that was on board the ships, designed to convert seawater into drinking water. And like many plumbing systems of the time, the pipes were made of lead. So why was this different to drinking water at home? Well, the process of filtration made the water softer and also heated it up, which made it absorb a higher amount of lead than conventional plumbing. It's grim to imagine that these men would have been poisoning themselves without even knowing. Although it's possible they may have found out in the later stages when symptoms started to appear, such as black gums, the damage would have already been done. They would have been drinking the water, boiling meat in it, and filling soups. There was no way it could be avoided. There was further evidence of lead in the tinned food, which when consumed in large volumes would cause problems. The lead contamination came from the soldering used to seal the cans, which would have been common practice. However, the cans posed a far greater danger. The large volume of tinned food was ordered rather last minute, and therefore to meet the demand, Goldner's, the canning company employed, rushed the process. This led to two problems. Firstly, the food inside was not processed enough, and secondly, they were improperly sealed. These two fatal flaws resulted in the contents of the cans spoiling and becoming inedible. As this was planned to be their main foodstuff for the bulk of the voyage, this would severely lower their rations. And more worryingly, there was a very real risk of contracting botulism from the spoilt goods. It was not immediately obvious that food had spoilt in these cans. Botulism would have been a frightening sight, and could swiftly take a life, causing severe respiratory failure and paralysation of the limbs. In late April of 1846, the ice had thawed enough for the crew to further progress, likely unaware of the dangers among them. But this progress wouldn't last long. The ships would be again frozen in the ice just north of King William Island. From there, they would never move again. In the final part of this series, we will take a look at the Inuit testimonies as to what happened to the crew and Franklin, and examine the artefacts left behind by the men as they travelled across the Arctic, in hopes of finding a rescue that never came.